Hello, and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we are beginning our discussion on Kristen Millares Young's debut novel, Subduction. Today we will be discussing the setting and characters alongside the major themes and attention the novel has received.
It's May 29th, so we're still in May. How's y'all summer going so far?
So far, so good.
Before summer classes,
the calm
right?
before the storm. Right?
So today we start we go back to the novel, so like you were saying, Vanessa, it had been a couple books, maybe even 3 in a row that it was all poetry collections. This is a book that came out last year, but of course last year is a freebie, right? I think so many books came out that weren't able to get that propulsion from, the book visits and book tours and all that. But there were some Zoom readings that Kristen had and I attended. I think y'all were saying you went to one or you were listening to one, right, Richie? So this is out of Red Hen Press. What can we say about the writer's background in this case?
What you got, Vanessa? Well, okay, so I did a little bit of just before reading the book. I was just interested. So reading into interviews, reviews online, because from what I've seen, there's a lot of good praise from the book. And so what we know is this is her debut novel, but she's not new to writing. She is has a background in investigative journalism. She's written essays, and of course now she's getting into her novel. What else can we say about Kristen?
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of recognition. I think most recently I saw that, it won the Nautilus Award. But there's several other ones that it's either been longlisted or been a finalist for. Did you want to, what was it, the VCU?
Yeah, so here I have that it's been longlisted for the VCU Cabell First Novelist Award. It's also a finalist for the Forward Indie Book of the Year Award, which I believe... Well, okay, anyway, but it's also, on top of that, it's also finalist for 2 International Latino Book Awards in 2020. And I think mighty high praise, it was also a staff pick by the Paris Review. And so if you're not familiar, Paris Review is just one of the big journals that I think a lot of people read. And so to get recognized is a high distinction. I read on a website, I believe, also the Independent Publisher Book Award for Multicultural Fiction. That came up. So as you can see, in even less than a year, it's picked up, lots of distinction. I was able to find plenty of interviews, not just in online print form, but interviews through Zoom calls, and so it's a lot of fun being able to have access to that kind of information. I was able to hear a lot of stuff from Young herself. By the way, so when we refer to her, do we say Millares Young or just Young? What do you guys think?
Well, as far as Kristen herself, so we were talking about this pre-show, right? She's Cuban American. We've never had a Cuban American writer per se, but if y'all remember with Natalia, who's a Peruvian background, she of course had that novel about the Cuban American family, Running, right?
Yes.
Kristen got her degree, her undergrad degree out of Harvard in Latino fiction, I guess / cultural fiction. Her MFA comes from Washington U. And her background actually, kind of like Hemingway, right? Comes in journalism. So, that's what you were saying, Rich. She's written several essays. So it's kind of always interesting kind of seeing someone, maybe we could talk about this if we do get a chance to talk to her about the shift between nonfiction and fiction. And most popular, which is that Snowfall article that some of you all out there and listening here might have heard or read, I should say, that got a lot of praise, won a Pulitzer. So Kristen was part of that New York Times team that, got its praise for the multimodal nature of it. It's a very kind of interactive story and a serial and series on avalanches. And so, if you haven't checked it out, I really do recommend it. But we're trying to see it on our phone, but it doesn't reproduce it the same way. But, so I found out about her through social media. So that's how I found out about the book. We were trying to see actually through UTEP if maybe we could feature her. But of course, that's when the pandemic happened. And so that kind of put a lot in the back burner. But now that things are finally kind of picking up, maybe we can do that in the future. And I really appreciate how open Kristen has been to all of that, and kind of, we talked to several writers and she's definitely among them. Red Hen Press is a publisher. I think it's the first time we are doing a Red Hen Press imprint. They're based out of Seattle. And so I think that's where she's based out of too, right? And so
I think so.
Northwest here.
Well, I know you've been there, right? I've never been there.
I went to Portland.
Oh, okay.
Oh, Portland.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
I guess they're pretty similar. I wouldn't know.
I enjoyed Seattle when I went.
Yeah.
Very much different terrain. Those hills or something else, especially getting by on foot. I walked around a lot of places. And that was a good challenge, like here in the Southwest, maybe we get just kind of more plains.
Right. So it was like Cardiac Hill over and over.
Over and over again, yeah. to an nth degree. But, something I've always tried to do because of my own studies is whenever I'm in a new city is try and learn as much as I can about it. And so, of course, Seattle and that area, right, has... there's similarities in the sense that, there's indigenous populations there that have their own history of course, colonialism and, of course, U.S. coming by and what happens in spaces like this. And so there's, I found some interesting books on like the founding of the city. And I think I did purchase a book when I was in Seattle. I found, first of all, I loved the weather. I know everyone kind of talks about it. And, like everyone hates it there.
Yeah.
You live there and experience it all the time. But again, being from the American Southwest and dealing with the heat and more dryness, it was nice as a visitor to experience. And of course, one of the things you got to experience is the coffee shops and the bookstores. I think that was like a mecca there in that, because I do know that it's known as a literary city. And
the city of grunge too,
grunge, Cobain, and then there's also a burgeoning hip hop scene out of there as well. So it's a pretty lively, thriving place filled with all sorts of cultures. And as we'll learn too, of course, from the book, there's a lot going on too historically and into the present. I remember just buying a bunch of books there. I bought a bunch of Bruce Lee, because he also went to the University of Washington, studied philosophy. A lot of people don't know that about him. I enjoy that. But yeah, I found some cool historical books that I brought back. Like one was called Sons of the Prophets. And of course, there's wordplay in the title, because when you hear prophets, you normally think of maybe a prophet with a PH. Right. In this case, we're talking prophets as in cha-ching, Profits. So kind of talking about some of the capitalistic movements of Seattle's upbringing as a major city. Yeah,
Microsoft and all that.
So anyway.
Then so how do you like that area? Like Portland and AWP it was, right?
Yes,
before
AWP.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Yeah, I also walked a lot of it. We didn't really use Uber or anything.
Yeah.
We did visit a lot of bookstores. Powell's is the one that we went to.
Nice.
We went there like every day. I was like, can we go back?
Yeah.
And we went to a lot of record stores too, and coffee shops. That was like our main thing, because since we were walking a lot, every coffee shop that we passed by, we were like, let's stop here.
Yeah.
So that was really cool.
So you were strung up on caffeine?
Oh, the whole time.
Nice.
And definitely a totally different AWP, right? With
very different,
Yeah.
in comparison to last year's.
Yeah.
Last year's.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Recently, of course, that area, the Pacific Northwest, was in the news last year, right? Because of the those zones that they established, right? That the forget what the acronym was.
Autonomous.
Something like that. Autonomous rain zones or something.
Yeah.
It's spelled out a word.
Yeah.
So it's also interesting, kind of looking at that area in regard to the like you said, not just the displacement of these indigenous communities and the burgeoning technological, areas that powerhouses that they became, and literary as well, right? You were saying, so Kristen right now is a writer in residence with the Hugo House. And so if you are listening, we'll add a link to on June 4th, she's got a reading with Tommy Orange, who wrote There. He's an indigenous writer, I think also from Seattle, I want to say. And it's a Hugo House reading. And Hugo House is another kind of literary establishment out of Seattle that funds writers. And, those writers' residences are always nice. My colleague from UTEP, Lex Williford, posted, he got one, I think for New Mexico or something like that. So it's kind of nice that those are kind of coming back, after the pandemic. Because I know our friend Yasmin, she was going to go to Belgium. If you all heard, she got some kind of residency there. That was right before this, so it's going to be last summer, I think. But so that's a little bit about Kristen, about the area. I've never been there myself. I've always wanted to go, but like I was saying, the history behind it is interesting from looking at it last year. I think at the same time, I've read some of the history as far as like the white power movement. So that's kind of interesting as well, because it is historically white because of, again, the indigenous communities being displaced. But so that's kind of interesting too. Subduction is the second book that we're covering that's been blurred by Luis Orea, right?
Oh,
yeah. So Gris is a Cuatli Girl. If you all haven't checked that one out, you can check out our episodes on it, and of course pick up a copy. Wonderful collection. But that's what we get here. The cover is also the Neah Bay, which is the right off of Washington, and the so you get kind of like this topographical look at the region. So it's a nice little cover like that.
One of the things I do like about the title is the actual title of the book there, Subduction. You look at it, it's actually kind of like cut in half through.
Oh, I hadn't. I didn't notice that.
Which it's not mentioned at all in the book, but right, I guess we'll dive into it. But the meaning of subduction. But here you have like it's in two parts, right, on top of each other. The title. So I thought that was a nice touch.
Yeah, the typography there is nice. Both typography and
topography. I was about to say the same thing. Looking at the map there.
Yeah.
So before we get to the characters, the setting, its themes, what are some of y'all's first impressions for readers without? Well, we can't really spoil it anyway. So
you want to bet? Okay.
I know with you, Vanessa, you're minoring, if I'm not mistaken, in anthropology, right?
Yeah.
So not to put you on the spot, but it's always nice when you can kind of channel some of your own academic experience into understanding a novel like this one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, so the main character, she's an anthropologist. And I think one of my biggest first impressions is just seeing the way in which people interact with one another. And I think also the way in which people interact with themselves. I don't know. Well, because I think we see, so the perspectives kind of switch between two of the main characters, Peter and Claudia. And, well, focusing more on Claudia, she's kind of going through a shift in her life. And so it's interesting to see the way that she deals with that within herself while she's also channeling it into her work. She's trying to, in a sense, distract herself, but at the same time, she's kind of figuring things out by studying these other the cultures that she's looking at.
And you were talking about that, Richie, pre-show, about how and you mentioned it, right, Vanessa, the coping mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And when we can, I think it's we can get into that a little bit, right? That, so she was, how can you explain that? Like, so her ex, right, her former husband, he ended up getting with her sister, Maria. And so, that's part of that, right? The trauma, and kind of the betrayal, right? So she's coping with that, and the way she's coping with that is by going deep into her work,
straight into her research. That's what I was going to mention or say, I guess, because you kind of asked us what our initial thoughts are, and one is, it's nice to be getting back into a novel. It's a different pace, it's a different type of reading that I guess I missed, honestly, because poems take a different kind of critical eye, I think, and whereas here in a novel, there's a little bit more pacing involved. But it's interesting because in these first two chapters, and there's a reason why I mentioned the first two chapters, because that's also how we learn there's varying points of view that Vanessa had mentioned. But there's a lot of exposition in those first two chapters. Like, that's kind of one of my marginal notes that I had made. And of course we'll talk about this more in the next episode, but we do learn a little bit more of that backstory, and it starts with this notion that you're talking about, where you have Claudia as one of our main characters. So one of the main point of views of the book is getting away from the situation by diving straight into her work. And that's definitely, there's something to be said about that. Critique.
I think in academia, especially, I think I'm guilty of that too. I think it shows how academia can really bury you in work, and you end up, neglecting other things in your life, right? And so there's this, right? I mean, we talked about burnout culture, right? We talked about it with that book,
Real Life.
Real Life, yes, thank you, by Brandon Taylor. So yeah, I think part of it is that, the subjects, right? So this is where it's set is Neah Bay. And so you mentioned Peter, Vanessa, right? So who is Peter? There's a little family tree, right? Yeah. So Peter is the son, right? Right. Maggie. Yeah.
We should probably talk about Maggie first.
Okay, yeah. So Maggie is of the Makah tribe, right? Which is a real indigenous community from there, from the Pacific Northwest. So, I was looking up the map. The map of the area actually shows what the Makah Nation is. And that's always interesting, right? Kind of thinking about the territories, basically. I think you were taking a class about that, right, Vanessa? About the Southwest territories, was it? Or the border, drawing the border, was it? Or was that another?
Well, I took a cultural anthropology class.
Oh,
Is that what we're
no,
talking?
an English one? Like early American
expansion of
yeah.
With
Dr. Gunn? Or was that
dang, I'm so bad at this. I believe it was Dr. Gunn.
Yeah. Well, my point is that with
I was like, wait.
the westward expansion.
yeah, and so I personally haven't read a lot of fiction that's talking about this area. I don't know about y'all, because I read this one when it first came out last year, so I'm kind of returning to it.
I read it before it was cool.
No. But so that's Maggie, right? And Maggie, so she is the mom. She's older. She's already, so part of it is she's suffering from dementia. And so this book is interesting in how it tackles that. I think, many of us out there might have a relative that has suffered from that. And I personally know someone like that. So, it's a kind of this brutal illness that you see little by little, right? The change in that person, right? And she's also, part of her condition is like hoarding, right? And so that's complicated. I think we of course can't dismiss that, and it's a big part of the novel.
Yeah, it is, because as we learn in chapter 2, we had another character introduction, which is Peter, and we kind of begin the story from his point of view. And I mentioned exposition, so we learn pretty much right away that Peter has left. He, like, for over 20 years he's been gone, and coming back into town because he had heard from, we had mentioned one of the people still that he grew up with, Roberta, had contacted him and mentioned his mother's dementia. And in just this introduction, he's very standoffish about coming back home. In his mannerisms, and he's seeing his mother for the first time in such a long time. So we get our introduction to Peter, right? He's a interesting character as well. He's an underwater welder, right? And that's kind of this in a very similar way. Interesting how he has kind of run away from problems as well. And of course, we start to understand. We learn through his eyes, kind of learning about his mother's hoarding habit when he kind of arrives, and seeing it as part of her dementia. But also maybe understanding that there's a little bit more behind it, because we understand that there's kind of a mystery around why that's why he left, and what do we find out from why is he kind of really there?
Well, he's kind of trying to figure out exactly what happened with his dad. I don't know. What should I get more into?
Yeah, we can mention it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a murder mystery kind of thing going on here.
Yeah, so this novel does deal with that idea of, there's this, like any other mystery novel, right? Is what happened? Why did it happen? And who is there? Someone covering it up?
Yeah. It's and it's a scene. It's a thing that apparently is still pretty vivid in Peter's like day-to-day life. Like he has, like, I guess almost like daydreams or like images of coming back to that. So it was clearly a very traumatic experience and memory for him, to the point where he is almost obsessed with wanting to find the truth, almost to the point where he's ready. I mean, now because of the news of his mother's failing memory, he wants to find out what he can. So it's almost like he's, it's a terrible thing to say, but like almost taking advantage of her. That's why he's there, rather than to, check up on her and take care of her.
Right. I mean, and that of course brings to mind how we preserve our families' cultures, right, and our cultures traditions. So that kind of, it's interesting how this novel. So you mentioned that about Peter, right? But we also have Claudia, right? And so Claudia is an immigrant, a Mexican immigrant, but she, like you said, right, she's an anthropologist, and of course, anthropology. Part of the conflict here is, to what degree does the observer become an observer participant, and the other thing is kind of the history of anthropology when it comes to indigenous communities, and like, they're the Makah people are very wary here in this novel of an outsider, right, as they rightfully should be, and it goes a little bit into that. I like how
right off the bat,
again, what else did y'all have as far as like connections to other works or themes?
Well, during the pre-show, I was mentioning how there's a spirit of this book that kind of reminds me of reading Milan Kundera. In particular, I think the unbearable lightness of being, I think, is a book that is deeply entrenched in questions. There's a lot of kind of philosophical nature to it, but it's still embedded within a story, within the actions and emotions and feelings and thoughts of characters. That's kind of the spirit I'm feeling from it. That, and of course, also the aspect of storytelling altogether. The fact that she does have two narrators, 2 point of views here, one of Claudia and one of Peter. And I think that does come back to her background in some of the work she's done. Kristen's background in journalism. One is that I know that she has worked a lot with marginalized communities, disenfranchised, and I think one of the questions, and I have to go back to a specific interview, but on the way over here, she was mentioning, she wanted to tell this story of the Makah and Claudia and what's happening there, but from a ethical point of view and storytelling, it wouldn't be right to tell this story and not include the Makah, include that part of the story.
Right.
And so now, you incorporate Peter's point of view, who is someone who is kind of become an outsider, because I think that is also one of the looming questions throughout. This, what does it mean to be an outsider in a place? And then also, but he is part of that tribe. We've talked about it to some degree of kind of generational changes, and of him wanting to kind of reject some part of his culture there. So it's going to be interesting to talk a little more in depth about these concepts. But that's that's what I picked up right away from reading this.
Yeah. And Vanessa, you were going to say also?
I was going to say that a little bit of hints of Patron Saints of Nothing, in the sense that he's returning home. Peter is returning home, kind of seeing what happened with the death of a family member.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's good. I brought up pre-show the other novel that was published posthumously by Arturo Islas, in work. I think it was Daniel Chacon who helped put it together. What's it called? Lamali and the King of Tears, because in that one, part of it is this anthropologist who's getting the story from the narrator. And so I actually had a really good NMSU student who wrote about, the problematic nature of getting that story and then ultimately basically mining it mining its story in a way that, because it's, there's an oral tradition, right, that comes with a lot of indigenous communities. And I think, there's a kind of, because of colonialism, it's not just the mining of the natural resources, but also the mining of this knowledge, right? And it goes back to, we talked about this a lot with Dr. Gunn's classes about, something like Blood Meridian, right, clearly shows that the military power is also tied to the knowledge of the area, right? And so that knowledge ends up being used against them.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not just specific to American Indians, right? But indigenous communities all over the world. And of course, so that's something that it's one of my favorite novels. I actually like it more than Rain God. And I know that might be blasphemy, but if y'all haven't read it, I think it's an amazing work of this character and how it's actually set in both San Francisco and here in El Paso. And so those two settings work really well in it. But yeah, so that's what it brought me to mind. Other than, thinking back to my anthropology classes and my early American Lit classes.
Same. Yeah. I think back to those as well, because I do remember taking a couple of sociology classes and as well, of course, through literature. There's a huge kind of tie-in a lot of things we read. Just the nature of, maybe like a field of study that requires that kind of interjection into a culture, into a space that isn't yours, and the power it comes, like being able to tell that story, and how oftentimes people make careers out of maybe embellishment, misappropriation or exploitation, misunderstandings, and kind of even maybe the ethics of kind of inserting yourself to take away like sacred knowledge and special knowledge and putting that out there.
Right. Yeah, actually, it's funny because someone just shared on social media. It was this older woman's. So she looked to be like in her 80s. She had her house that was still, it wasn't a modern house, right? So it was like I don't know what material it would be, but something that. Someone came in, right? And turned it into like a modern house, right? But they were posting it as a kind of, showing, oh, look what I did here to improve this person's livelihood, right? But at the same time, like you're saying, right? I mean, there's that problematic nature of, white people coming into these territories that aren't and lands that aren't theirs. Or that, or stolen, right? And but what's interesting is that Claudia is Latinx, right? And of course, Latinx itself doesn't mean that you're brown, right? It just means that you're not, like, because you could be like, like for instance, Brazil, and so or even in Mexico, right? You go to Mexico, that there's like white people in Mexico, right? But they're still Mexican. So
a lot of people still have trouble grasping these notions,
right? I mean, it does kind of go into a lot of rabbit holes, right? Of like, and that's why identity is so important. But I think a lot of people wrestle with that naturally. So she feels like she doesn't quite, of course, belong back home because of what happened with her own sister, right? And at the same time, of course, Maggie is very skeptical of her, and so that's definitely a big conflict. But with Peter, it gets interesting because, as the novel goes on, they end up developing their relationship together. So it's one of the things that drew me about this novel.
Right. Full from from her job standpoint, that's a huge no-no, right?
And that's where I think you were hinting, right, with seduction being kind of the wordplay of the title.
At least in sound, right?
Sorry?
At least in sound. Like we again, it's one of the interviews I was listening to with Young, with Kristen, and she actually mentioned, or it was asked of her, right? Because it is subduction, and in this case, it refers to the movement of plates, tectonic plates in our Earth, and them being kind of over each other, one under on top, and that's a great image for. I mean, God, the more I read the novel and what's happening with the characters and the way the past is affecting the present, it's such a great title. But also in that this interview, and I can't remember right now off the top of my head. This was just me casually listening it, driving over here. But, they mentioned, well, in the title, subduction, you also kind of hear the word seduction. And Kristen did mention, she referred to one of her poet friends and mentors who said oftentimes it's kind of one of the things in language, you have a word that's kind of within a word. And so that's an aspect, because you do have this relationship that I think it's complicated, right? There's a lot to talk about that in its own right.
And I think part of it is because she's so vulnerable, right? I can't imagine what that must be like. Well, you can, right? Because you read her background, and so both academia and kind of this, going into, like you said, right, another place that is not yours, right? And how the two are woven together is something that this novel, of course, establishes throughout. And the writing is, it's engaging, it's understandable. There is some Spanish given Claudia's background. It's italicized, I noticed, so it definitely jumps out at you. And like I said, you do get some of the history of the Makah, which I think is, of course, important. Yeah. Given that, last year there and even to this day, there's been issues with like works that, like you said, appropriate other cultures, right, that are not theirs. Yeah. So I think it's definitely interesting how those two perspectives, give you those two different sides.
Yeah, I think the word I was looking for earlier was responsibility. The responsibility of working with other stories and sharing them. And so I do want to point out, I do remember, in my prep for reading this book, there is a really good interview online that you can find from the University of Washington, The Daily, with Armin Madavi of June of 2020, where it's an interview with Kristen. Definitely recommend you guys check it out. You can just find it online. But Kristen mentions that once she had committed to the idea of writing the book, it actually took her 2 or 3 years of just researching with no writing of the book whatsoever. And she says because she felt that she needed to grapple with the history that had not been taught to her. So, I mean, just that in its own right kind of says a lot about the care she took with some of this information.
Right. Yeah, because that makes sense, given that she's from there, and that kind of, we can talk about that later about how we don't, we've talked about this a lot, right? That in our in our classes here, our upbringings and education, you don't really get too much of the border history, right? You don't get too much of like, Pachucos or Chicano history or, it's of course very Eurocentric, or even like, we are upon the anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And, a lot of, like, I was reading so many people and how it wasn't just our generation that didn't get taught. I was listening or reading the author, William Gibson. He's a sci-fi writer. He wrote Neuromancer, the whole cyberpunk thing. And he was mentioning how he wasn't taught that either, right? And so it just kind of goes to show that it's been these multiple generations that don't get taught, these things that happen to African-American communities, indigenous communities, right? All of this erasure that has gone on in the classroom, and that becomes realized in redlining, gentrification, etc. Mm-hmm. So I think that is a testament, like you're saying, to Kristen's ethics, right? And writing about this community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. From that same interview, she also mentions that I pulled quotes that I thought were really relevant and interesting. Obviously it's relevant because they're talking about the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she says, Claudia doesn't think like I do, act like I do, but I can examine some of my concerns and invoke meta-awareness of the problematic nature of trying to tell a story that is a story of contact.
Mm.
And she goes on to refer to the fact that we live in a multicultural, polyphonic world. So I thought that was okay. I like what she's saying there.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, Vanessa, that we didn't cover?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
It opens with, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, with our next episode, but an epigraph from Wilson Duff. But also I like I like the epigraph from James Baldwin.
It's a great quote, yeah.
Brings to mind the title. Yeah. The sea rises, the light fails, lovers cling to each other, and children cling to us. The moment we cease to hold each other, the moment we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the light goes out. And also talking about the earth is always shifting, the light is always changing, the sea does not cease to grind down rock, generations do not cease to be born, and we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have.
Mm.
So does a nice job of kind of capturing what this novel is trying to do here.
Yeah.
So I think we'll leave it there, and next time we'll talk about the first half of Kristen's debut.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, brought to you by Border Census and Power at the Pass. This episode we discussed Subduction by Kristen Millares Young. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode as we continue this discussion. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.